Hi, I want to make a video on claims of pain beyond your understanding. Obviously, this is just a meme. It's just words coming out of a mouth. Obviously, I've made this distinction before in describing the distinction between the interaction that we experience and the reality that we're experiencing it as a whole. It's just an interaction. The words, the memes, the ideas, the words, the concepts, this mutual understanding, it only exists because it's a mutual understanding. Say something like when a person says, it's beyond your understanding of the pain I experience. It's just them describing a certain circumstance, contriving a certain circumstance, and describing something. Um, Even though to a certain extent it can be applied, like I say, the equilibrium or like I mentioned in another video, equilibrium or compensation, it can be understood because you may not have experienced as much pain and you don't realize it until you've experienced something, using this specific example. But it's the very foundation that I want to make the video about anyway. To a certain extent, it's just this interaction that we're having. There's a disconnection between the interaction we're having and the reality itself because we're in the reality, describing the reality inside the reality based on interaction more than the actual description that we're describing the reality with. It's more about the interaction that I'm having. And the interaction is the very foundation of existence, and that's exactly how everything is interacting, is based on this interaction, and it's the interaction as a whole that matters, and everything is just essentially an interaction. As a whole, my interaction, my, and it's this distinction between interaction of a sentient being and something else that's not, say, sentient, or my interaction with something, and that's where we have to derive our value from, is the sentience and this interaction that we're experiencing. Um, so when a person says this, and I guess this can go to apply to many other circumstances in describing the situations of reality. So pain, when someone describes something like this, obviously it's another contrivance of language, another contrivance used based on this vague distinction of, and this um, vague, um, vague interaction, a vague idea of me speaking using my voice. This voice means nothing if there's no mutual understanding of meaning something. I wouldn't understand it to begin with. I wouldn't be speaking to begin with if someone else wasn't mutually speaking with me, or I wouldn't have learned it myself. Obviously, it has to come from somewhere, and it's coming from a mutual, between other beings, interaction. And that's where it has some kind of meaning because it has a mutual interaction affecting the whole and based on these small pieces interacting with each other. And that's where it means something as a whole. The futility comes from the foundation, but it doesn't mean you can't change the foundation of it as a whole and fight within the futility to change something inside the futility to make a difference. Regardless, you can only fight the futility so much, but it has to be within the boundaries of the bedrock of reality and the function of reality, describing the futility. But it's a futility beyond your understanding, or just contrivances. Obviously, the futility is something we can logically come to, but it's a logical conclusion that you base off of a contrivance of psychology, and the futility comes from psychology because the psychology creates this futility based on the idea that it's philosophy creates this, is created by this sentience based on this psychology, and that's where this whole idea of futility comes from, is based on the psychology interacting and recognizing futility, because without the psychology, something like futility and recognition of reality wouldn't mean anything in many cases. But I would say to a certain lesser extent, to most of other words and descriptions and things describing things, can be described only to a certain extent, sort of like futility, describing the reality of our situation, sort of like futility. Other words can be described in a similar circumstance. So, um, yes, the futility of our existence um, is a contrivance, sort of like the same extent saying um, a pain beyond your understanding. And I do apologize if my videos tonight aren't as good as usual. I don't want to make videos because it's getting very redundant, and I'm almost grasping at straws trying to make these videos, trying to find different things to talk about because I've already covered the same things over and over again. But anyway, I think it's good to connect all these ideas, and it's good sometimes to grasp at straws to find ideas to talk about. But anyway, it's coming from different points of view, and having all these points of view congeal into one, so you can try to make it mean something in the end, because it means something when you have all these ideas and you make them a coherency. Even though maybe I'm not describing them as coherent as I can, at least I'm putting a webbing together and describing all these circumstances and how they may come together as a whole anyway. So like futility is a contrivance of like psychology and existence, and that's where the idea of futility comes from, because it wouldn't exist. Sort of like philosophy has to do with value. Futility has to do with value based on the psychology, and without the psychology existing and recognition of reality and futility, utility wouldn't exist. But futility is a contrivance of psychology anyway, and it's something you could fight against. You can say you can just find pleasure in, eating your meal every day. But psychologically speaking, there's other ways of more accurately describing the situation other than futility. It's redundant. Something you do over and over again, that's a fact that you can't escape. And it's something you can change, but you're not going to change the facts that something's happening a certain way, and it describes itself. Reality describes itself, and the reality is describing the function, and the function is either you repeat the same process over and over again, or you don't do the process at all. You're eating over and over again, sort of like it's either you eat over and over again to survive, or you don't eat at all, or you drink, or any circumstance. It's either over and over again or not at all. You do it once, and essentially it's a not at all at that point. It's once and then not at all. It's either you do it again or not at all. And that's exactly where the futility comes from, a redundant process of either doing it over and over again or stopping or not doing it at all. That's exactly the foundation and the function of this existence is based on that very function. And that's the part of the function is that creates this futility, and knowing that we're going nowhere and we're only escaping negatives, and we're trying to make it better for everyone, and we can only make it better for everyone, and we don't necessarily know it's just based on this interaction, a deterministic mechanism that we can only change so much to a certain extent. And every single action that we take, we're usually, if I take something, it's taking away from something someone else. So if I want it, someone else wants it. Typically speaking, if I have it, they're not going to have it, because we're living in a finite sandbox, and we can only do so much to make it so everyone else gets what they want. And you can contrive someone. I just want everything. A person wants everything. Therefore, you take something. Therefore, they're not going to have. It's just one more thing, less thing that they're going to have to want everything. Therefore, there's a deprivation created in them. And therefore it's contrived for using an example, but obviously a person can fool themselves into thinking that therefore it becomes a necessary thing to satisfy them, at least at that point, in describing their psychology. And therefore you can only do so much to mitigate against suffering all at once at one time, in any circumstance. And if you take away from something, you're usually taking something that someone else could have had. But then again, something's going to happen a certain way, and there's only so much you can do to change that. You can make your decisions going forward, but you can only do so much. And once you've eaten the meal that could have gone to someone else, it's already been done. And even if a meal magically appears out of nowhere, it doesn't mean that you didn't take the meal to begin with, because a meal magically appeared out of nowhere, used as a contrivance, just because you ate the meal, and it's existing for someone else now. If that makes any sense. So back to the basic idea one more time. So going back to the contrivances and the a pain beyond your understanding. Obviously, that specific example can obviously it's something that you don't understand at this point, but you will understand. Say if you experience something that someone's describing, but then again, the description could be completely null and void, completely irrelevant, irrational, because this could be something you understand. And it goes back to this disconnection between the interaction, like I mentioned, between, say, speaking, describing something, a person's ideas and their interaction, and the interaction itself existing, and the reality that they're existing and describing in and of itself. So there's only so much you can do to describe the reality as best you can, and there's better ways of describing reality than, say, futility, and using that as a way of describing reality, and recognizing that there's a redundancy of function, and that's what creates futility, and that's what creates definitions to be more accurate in describing a fundamental aspect of moving forward, of creating a stair-step way of describing and using definitions, a regression of definitions. And it usually requires a regression of definitions. It requires a lot of words or a lot of definitions to describe something more and more accurately. And that's exactly what we're trying to do, is describe reality more and more accurately. And, like futility, like redundancy, like concepts like a pain beyond your understanding. There's a certain extent that you can only describe them so much in a certain way, because obviously it's just ideas, interactions, a bunch of interactions going through other interactions to describe a circumstance. And almost in a way, almost seems like it zeroes itself out regardless of all the definitions. It has to go through so many mediums that all the definitions you give almost seem to be redundant in describing a certain circumstance. But the thing is reality describes a certain circumstance, and value exists based on the circumstances. And value is something that exists in and of itself, and it's something that's going to have a certain number in the end, regardless of if we could put our fingers on that number. Even if we don't have an exact number, we're contriving a scale to put that number on. The number exists. There's something that exists. There's a value that exists, regardless of our being able to recognize it or anything like that. And value in and of itself has value, but the definition in which we're describing that value is contrived. It has value. I want it less. I want to escape this. Therefore, it has value. And I think that's where many people confuse it. It has value regardless of that distinction that you make between confusing those ideas of this vagary in describing circumstances and contrivances, and mixing that up with the fact that value still has value, regardless of the fact that we contrive a skill to put that value on. It has value. It's seen something. And the value that the contrived thing that you're almost forced into put in describing it like by value, because you're using a word to put it on a scale, is almost mitigating against the fact that it is something that means something. And the very fact that you say value based on a scale or based on a number almost in a way mitigates against the fact that it has value, because you're putting on a contrived scale doesn't mean it doesn't have value. It has value regardless. Something that has value regardless of what you think or don't think has value anyway. So yeah, I mean, I guess I went in a different direction with this video, but I think that it's a good thing to describe and go over again and more thoroughly. But a pain beyond your understanding, and that really goes down to value, pain, suffering. You don't understand this pain I'm going through. But obviously that's a contrivance in their explanation describing a certain circumstance, and they don't necessarily know. They're projecting onto you, even if you say you didn't necessarily understand what they're saying. So a pain beyond your understanding is something, and that is a contrivance. But it's a description, and the description exists, but the explanation, the point exists, and the idea exists, and to a certain extent in a certain way, but it only exists to a certain extent, a certain way and such. I don't know where I'm going with that. Anyway, I think I got the point across good enough. So I think that's all I want to mention in this video. Yeah, I think that's all I need to mention. So thank you, and until next time. If I need to mention anything else on this subject, I'll mention it in another video. So thank you, and until next time, bye.